Greetings, my name is Dr. Ed Vieira, and I am an Associate Professor and Research Director at Simmons College School of Management. My research article, The Relationships Among Girls, Prosocial, Video Gaming, Perspective Taking, Sympathy, and Thoughts About Violence, was first published online in Communication Research, a SAGE publication, on November 15th, 2012, and later in hard copy in 2014, located in Volume 41, Section 7, pages 892 to 912. I was inspired to examine the potential benefits of prosocial or nonviolent video games by a California-based company, Club Pony Pals, which specialized in prosocial cloud-based video games primarily played by girls. The principal of the company thought that most gaming research focused on the negative aspects of violent gaming, and that researchers should be open-minded and look at possible positive effects of video gaming. I thought that was a fair criticism and decided to conduct such a study, which would be a follow-up to a published study of mine that examined violent video gaming exposure. This study is an attempt to explore girls' prosocial video gaming and exposure as a learning mechanism from which to assess different violent scenarios where the abilities to perspective take and sympathize play key roles. Cognitive or perspective taking related learning and emotional or sympathy related learning are presented as important to prosocial thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. More specifically, the aim of this study is to explore thoughts about mild and severe and justified and unjustified aggression and their relationship to the cognitive and affective roots of learning through prosocial video gaming. One may ask, what is prosocial behavior? According to Penner and colleagues, prosocial behavior is a broad category of behaviors that are defined by some significant segment of society and/or one social group as generally beneficial to other people. In other words, it is a behavior that is conducted to do some perceived good directed at another party, whether that party is a person, the environment, an idea, and so forth. Informed by social cognitive learning theory, the general learning model developed by Anderson and colleagues holds that individuals learn through observation and through direct experience or modeling of behaviors. This can occur through repeated video game play where gamers' behaviors are rewarded or punished. Rewarded behavior motivates people to continue the action and develop positive attitudes toward the particular behaviors, which then become valued. Learning occurs at the cognitive or rational level, as well as the affective or emotional level and arousal level. The effects of repeated gameplay suggests that influences are long-term through cognitive and affective processes which correspond with learned sensitization, that is, perspective taking and sympathy, respectively. Perspective taking is the ability to understand the mind of another person. It is a cognitive process. Sympathy is the ability to feel for another person. It is primarily an emotional process. This study posits that generally a person must first understand what another is going through before feeling sorrow or sympathy for that person. Note, affects consist of emotions and moods. So an affective state would be an emotional state. Each repeated exposure to a video game is like another learning trial. Over time, the activated knowledge structures become more ingrained and more readily accessible with subsequent gaming exposure and similarly connected real-life experiences. In the case of prosocial learning, the creation of knowledge structures that encourage prosocial behaviors can change a person's personality and cause that person to have more prosocial responses to environmental opportunities that enhance understanding and sympathy for others. Thus, through these routes, learning and moral reasoning about aggression can take place. The effects of these processes not only influence factual learning, but also facilitate the learning of values, beliefs, and behaviors that can shape personality by creating and or altering prosocial or antisocial related knowledge structures within a person. In other words, over time, a person's personality can be influenced and perhaps even shaped at some level through gameplay, whether prosocial or even antisocial. How might the prosocial perspective or prosocial personality reason about morality? Let us start with a definition of moral reasoning. Moral reasoning is the ability to make and explain ethical choices. It emerges from an individual's internal construction of the social world based on experience and personal values. Kohlberg believed that moral reasoning is primarily a cognitive process consisting of logical reasoning based on one's developmental stage and experiences. However, moral reasoning also has an affective or emotional component, mainly via perspective taking, especially as children grow older developmentally. As children learn about the perspectives and feelings of others, their moral structures expand to incorporate those influences and complexities. Interaction with broader social environmental factors also encourage the development of even more elaborative knowledge structures that reflect not only the needs and perspectives of the child, but also of those persons and organizations in a child's environment. In fact, those individuals who learn that there are consequences to the victim from violent acts are likely to demonstrate better perspective taking when attempting to understand such violent behaviors and the ramifications of those behaviors. However, when affective responses such as sympathy are dampened, it is probable that less sympathy for the victim would lead children to see violence as less harmful, less problematic, and perhaps acceptable under certain conditions. Past research has found a significant relationship between sympathy and perspective taking, where individuals who are better able to perspective take are more likely to feel sympathy toward others, particularly toward victims. This ability to imagine the point of view of another and to access higher order social emotional knowledge structures can influence children's moral reasoning about certain kinds of violence and aggression through a more complex process of understanding. Along the same lines, further research on children's reasoning about violence has found that children can distinguish between justified and unjustified violence. Moreover, with age, children develop cognitively and become better equipped to think abstractly and thus learn to understand the perspective of others. In sum, I think that through repeated exposure to prosocial video gaming, children learn to be more empathetic and thus more sympathetic toward others. The dynamic of empathy or perspective taking and sympathy is a sensitization process that influences evaluations of whether, in the case of this study, violent acts justified as opposed to unjustified, severe or not severe, are perceived as appropriate. Exposure to prosocial gaming will positively relate to ability to empathize. So in other words, prosocial gaming exposure will increase a child's ability to have empathy for another. Hypothesis 2. This perspective-taking ability or empathy as a result of prosocial gaming will have a positive effect on the ability to sympathize for those particular individuals. So positive video gaming, prosocial video gaming has a positive effect or increases or facilitates the ability to empathize, and the ability to empathize facilitates the ability to have sympathy for another. Hypothesis 3. Those who sympathize more will most likely see violence or view violence as wrong. Hypothesis 4 stands to reason that if individuals saw the less severe case of violence as wrong, they would certainly see the more severe case of violence as wrong. Hypothesis 5, there will be a positive relationship between the child's age or respondent age and perspective-taking ability. We would think from a cognitive perspective that as a child becomes more cognitively mature, the child develops a greater ability to empathize for another. This study was a self-report or survey design consisting of 24 questions, including basic demographic information, measures of video gaming behaviors, responses to perspective-taking scenarios, questions relating to sympathy, and 4 violent-related scenarios where participants expressed agreement or disagreement with the violent perpetrator's actions. The scenario's key attributes were 1 case of unjustified violence and relatively minor violence against the victim. Another involved unjustified violence scenario where the victim was hospitalized. A 3rd case was of justified violence involving relatively minor violence against the victim. And the last scenario was a justified violent case where the victim was hospitalized. The attribute of justified violence meant that the perpetrator had some reason or some perceived reason for perpetrating violence against another person. The sample consisted of 145 girls between the ages of 7 and 15 from 12 countries, including the United States, Canada, Australia, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. The mean or average age was 11.31 years, and the median age was 11 years. The data were collected using a self-report survey. Descriptive statistics were tabulated. Factor analysis was conducted to determine latent variables, and relationships among variables were examined using structural equation modeling, which is a type of multiple linear regression. As hypothesized, those girls who reported more prosocial gaming experience were associated with greater perspective-taking or empathy and more sympathy toward others, which in turn was associated with girls' evaluations about the usage of violence under different conditions. This study suggests that it is easier to convince someone to do something that is right rather than to persuade someone to do something that is violent or wrong. Activities that are clearly unwarranted with no apparent justification are assessed as wrong. However, in those situations where there appears to be a reason of justification for violent behavior, some sympathy for the perpetrator or situation plays a role, as well as perspective taking, thus demonstrating complex reasoning. It might be, in the case of certain circumstances, the process of moral reasoning about violence changes. However, the moral assessments remain the same. They remain unchanged. In other words, what is wrong is still wrong, but perhaps not as much. What is the significance of this study? Why is it important? First, to date, there are few studies that examine the cognitive and emotional benefits of prosocial video games. Second, according to Dodge and colleagues, prosocial video games can be transformative to the gamer, suggesting that through participation in learning, which is reinforced by a community of like-minded players, a collective resonance develops where gamers share the gaming reality that they create. They identify with this resonance, which can influence personality development. Repeated exposure can have lasting influences on the individual's personality, which leads to the last point. The fact that children found justified cases of violence as less wrong has all sorts of ramifications for society, especially once these kids become the voting public as adults. They may very well be inclined to support wars or preemptive military-based actions based on some justified reason. The same logic could be applied to the enforcement of laws such as prison sentences and capital punishment. As we can see, the implications are certainly far-reaching. This study has a number of limitations. First, participants were girls. A sample including boys would provide a representative data set of children. Second, the response rate was 7.5%. A higher response rate was desirable and would have contributed to a representative sample of the population. Third, the study was cross-sectional and correlational. A longitudinal study would be more valid in order to establish long-term effects and predictability. Fourth, the sample size was relatively small and thus lends itself to type 2 error. Fifth, the dominant prosocial video game reported was Club Pony Pals, which involves the curing horses and people. A study involving different types of prosocial video games and content might reveal different results. Sixth, it is likely that a person can sympathize for another individual without cognitively understanding that person. Thus, measures that include both cognitive and emotional empathy or perspective-taking measures might cover a broader range of possible conditions. 7. It is important to note that prosocial and antisocial video game content cannot easily be separated into dichotomous categories. Antisocial behavior can consist of aggression, delinquent behaviors, and/or any behaviors harmful to others or detrimental to self and/or society. Thus, it is possible that some antisocial video games do not contain violence or would contain aggression that is not physical. Next, the nature of a video game may be such that its goals may involve justified violence in the service of a higher good, such as righting a wrong or protecting people, as in the case of using military action in a video game to protect the population, as opposed to gratuitous violence, which is for its own sake and not a prosocial reason. Last, the moral reasoning scenarios were single-item measures. Future research should include experimental research designs that incorporate the arousal route along with cognitive and affective processes. Future study might also examine whether individuals assess the costs and benefits involved with prosocial behaviors. Penner and colleagues think that whether someone helps another involves the costs associated with the helping behavior and whether and how the person identifies with the behavior and group associated with the behavior. Other areas of study may involve the micro and macro nature of the prosocial behavior and its relationship to perspective taking and sympathy. For example, actions such as volunteerism or interpersonal acts of kindness may operate differently. Even within an interpersonal level, there are differences. For instance, the nature of altruism can be influenced by whether the good deed is contingent upon reciprocity. As we can see, the benefits of prosocial gaming are influenced by a number of moderating and mediating factors that should be explored. Perhaps more diverse violent or antisocial behavioral scenarios might reveal more nuances in the relationships among the study variables and the various moral dilemmas. These scenarios might be framed in the second person where the participant is the perpetrator or victim. Finally, future research should include personality trait variables that capture prosocial predispositions in an effort to discover a more complete picture, including the role of genetics in this process. Thank you for your interest in this research.